Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Bernard Khoury?
It is Bernard.
Bernard, what a pleasure to have you on the line. This is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes.
Yeah.
I am delighted.
Yes, Paul.
How are you?
I'm good.
And
alive and kicking.
Yeah, beats alternatives. Where do I find you?
Where do you find me? Geographically?
Geographically, spiritually, however you wish to answer that question.
Well, geographically, I am in the quarantine as we speak. You know, my office is located in an area called the Quarantine.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it used to be the Quarantine of the port up until the early 20th century. And then the whole area became a refugee camp in 1915, after 1915, with the Armenians coming. So they were given the camp, and they stayed here for a while, and then they moved across the river, the other side, and then slowly after 1948, it was the Palestinians that came, and then other refugees from southern Lebanon, Kurds, Syrians. So my office is in that very problematic area called the Quarantine. It also happens to be the area where I built my first project.
Right.
So I have something with the Quarantine.
You have something with the Quarantine. You live in the Quarantine.
I think my whole life is the Quarantine.
Tell me about that. I'm curious. And when you say that area, it's in Beirut. I just want to be specific for our listeners.
Yes. It is in Beirut. It is near the port of Beirut. It was the Quarantine of the port.
Right.
So everything stinks here. You know, we have nobody lives here. You have the slaughterhouses, the main processing area of the garbage company, the tanneries. It stinks around here, but I love it. I have something for areas that are in convalescence. It is the story of my life. Problematic zone, toxic grounds.
I feel like asking you, but you've already answered that question. How long have you had that problem?
I came out of toxic grounds. It's the story of my life, but you know, you can be good. You can, these are my favorite battlegrounds. This is where you can work. This is where you're needed as an artist, as an architect. I'm not comfortable in comfortable areas.
And how comfortable are you in uncomfortable areas?
Very comfortable.
or so you say. Now, in 2017, Bernard, you were asked, where would you most like to build where you haven't already? And you answered, an after-hours club in Mecca or a Home Depot in the Vatican. Now, Bernard, how seriously can I take that answer? I know
very seriously.
Hmm.
I mean, we aren't we allowed to have visions of some sort?
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, in other words, this is a serious desire.
Well, improbable projects. But obviously, this is fantasy. I mean, this is when you're asked such a question, you're allowed to go beyond the limits of the possible.
For sure.
See, I'm confined within the limits of the possible because that's what my profession is about. So when I'm given the freedom to fantasize, I take comfort in doing it.
I have to say that for listeners, if they can find online the Proust questionnaire with Bernard Khoury, it's rather delightful. It's delightful, and sometimes, my goodness, when for instance reads who is your favorite artist, Bashar el-Assad, who's
You picked that up.
Franchement, and then what is your favorite poet? I could see that. I think there might be a germ of truth, probably even for you there. That when you say Georges Brassens.
Yeah, I love Brassens.
Yeah, I imagine Brassens, Reggiani, Aznavour, that whole world, a world really that has disappeared, and in a sense.
Well, Brassens particularly. Reggiani never really wrote anything. He was a very good interpreter, but Brassens was a great poet.
Right. Brassens, Brel. I mean, those French singers who really, I mean, in the case of Brel, Belgian singers who really wrote and interpreted their own music. Now,
yeah, I mean, I can love Brel, but Brel cries too much to me. Brassens has another dimension which I find he's not cynical; he's ironic, and there's great intelligence in his poetry. It would be impossible to write what he writes today. To write what he said today.
How would you make a difference between those two terms, between cynical and ironic?
Well, I hate cynical people. Cynicism has a distance. Cynicism has no. I hate cynical people. No, ironic has another dimension. You can have very good intentions and be ironic. Cynical people are badly toxic.
You know, I always like reminding people of the origin of the word sarcasm, the etymology. Do you know it?
I don't know the origin of sarcasm, no. But I'm not a sarcastic person.
But the origin of sarcasm, you might like it when you hear it. It comes from a Greek word, and it means to bite in the flesh.
Uh-huh.
That's something, no? Now, can a building be ironic?
Of course. And a building can be very cynical. I think architecture has been very cynical over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And that's not good. But there's not enough irony. There's a lot of cynicism. In art also. In most creative fields. You could be ironic and very romantic. Cynical people are not romantic.
And you see yourself as romantic?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hopelessly.
Hopelessly? You mean against your better judgment?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that you resist sketching and drawing until a concept is clear in your mind. Is that both true, and is that what's happening now?
Well, it has been true for a very long time because, I think I can draw fairly well. But drawing has something very dangerously seductive about it, in the sense that you can get carried away with certain instincts. I have the tendency, most people who draw fairly well have the tendency to be seduced by certain forms of aesthetics that are established, and get carried away with the seduction of the syntax of a certain aesthetic that is clearly referenced, and you can get trapped in that. So I think fairly early in my architectural training, I resisted that, which was not easy at school. I went through 7 years of education without a parallel ruler. There weren't many computers at the time around. So I was making things with my hands, but sometimes, through a 3 or 4 months period of a studio, I wouldn't produce any visuals until a week before the end. So there was a lot of talk, and it annoyed my critics and my professors. But I think that the speech, the verb, the narrative liberates you. It gives your work another dimension, which is not necessarily architectural. I was fairly deceived with the limits of architecture pretty early.
Deceived.
Yeah, deceived by the limits.
Why deceived? Deceived also implies that somebody or something was offering you something that then turned into a deception.
Well, you have to understand where I come from. I was raised in a family of architects. Both my parents are architects. My father was probably one of the best drawers I've ever met. So I was very seduced by the power of architecture in its very basic sense of the term. I was raised in walls and buildings that my father had built, slept in beds that he had designed, studied on desks he had designed, sat on chairs that he had built, and so on and so forth. So, and then fairly early in my architectural education, not at school, through readings, people like Virilio, I'm talking more in the mid-'80s, late 80s, I soon realized that I was stuck in the Stone Age, that we were going through a revolution that maybe my practice would not survive. So I was desperately looking for other means to produce meaning, and those were not necessarily strictly architectural. So I resorted to narratives, to building scenarios, to try to define a project in words, in intentions, and not necessarily with the conventional means of architecture, not necessarily through form. The avant-garde at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, was desperately seeking to invent forms. I was not interested in forms. I thought that our society was producing meaning no longer through matter, no longer through form, but through means that were far more dynamic, far more volatile. And so I found refuge in the creation of narratives, scenarios. And I would never draw a project until I knew exactly how I could tell the story, how I could construct the situation. This is what mattered. And then the architectural exercise became, at the end of the day, producing the instruments that would make these situations possible. And I would like to see my work as mainly instruments. Instruments that produce situations, and not necessarily architectural performance or architecture judged only through the very narrow lens of the practice.
Yes, you've said, this struck me, I'm not here to produce architecture, I'm here to produce meaning in the city.
That's what I aspire to. Yes.
You know, Bernard,
and it's very difficult for an architect today. I think our practice is certainly has lost the relevance that it had up until the 19th century. Virilio said it in very clear terms. It has to do with the acceleration of the mechanical speed that we thought we were part of in the history of modernism. It took us a few decades, and by the 1950s or 60s, we started questioning what we had produced. And that questioning produced very pathetic architecture. Postmodernism architecture had nothing to do with postmodernism. It was a complete flop. And what came in the 80s was even more pathetic. The so-called deconstructivism that had nothing to do. And then we're in a complete sterile period today. I think architecture is is probably living its darkest age.
You were mentioning your
But let's not be too negative.
No. You were mentioning your father, and it must be extraordinary in a way to both have that model in a sense, then to have a counter model and to have the weight of everything that he was able and your mother to do. But I'm curious also, Bernard. He built hospitals and schools and social housing. Do you feel that you might want to go in that, join him at all and build hospitals? And
I wish I could. My father was a much better architect than I am, but it's a problem of generations. You know, they were heroes. They thought they were heroes. They had political ideals. They had a project. Today, it's extremely difficult to have a project. Where I come from, at least, where I decided to base myself, there are no institutions. There are no institutions to serve. The nation-state project has completely collapsed and failed. So we are not given the heroic commissions that our parents were given or our grandparents were given. This is over. I mean, Europe and some more secure territories still want to produce or to maintain certain ideals through public projects, but they don't constitute 1% of the built territories. The cities are in the hands of the private sector, no longer of the public sector. And if we architects don't understand this very rough and tough and sour reality, the cities will happen despite us and without us architects. So I think that the noble battles today have to be fought in the mud, in the most difficult situations, in programs that are not necessarily noble. Yes, in building a mall or a nightclub, whether it's in Mecca or in the or in any other sacred place. This is where relevant meaning has to be produced with extremely sour and toxic ingredients. We have to have the courage to face those realities. And I think architects and the elite of the architectural world today are still hiding behind politically correct postures that are that no longer stand. It's bullshit.
You know, you mentioned that you were a hopeless romantic, which is the title that the journal, the extremely beautiful journal produced in Beirut, called Zafar. There's a wonderful interview.
Yes.
Wonderful interview with you and Gait Abi Ghanem. I probably am not pronouncing his name correctly, but in Zafar, in the number 4 Zafar issue, you say most of our fabric today is constituted of what I would call solitary and impermeable islands, entities or buildings that are not in dialogue with each other. And that is, I mean, for me, who is so interested in dialogue altogether, because I do believe very much like Tristan Tzara that thought is made in the mouth, and it's made by...
Of course. And I try to engage in dialogue in my buildings, in a fabric where dialogue is almost impossible. And this is why I would qualify most of my interventions in Beirut as suicidal, because they're buildings that basically open their arms totally naked, waiting for the neighbor to come and punch you straight in the face. But my buildings are naked. They engage with the territory. They do exactly the opposite of what's been done the last 40 or 50 years, which are completely airtight buildings that do not engage in any sort of common project. In the absence of a common project, you either take a defensive posture and you turn your back to your future neighbor, as you don't know what's going to happen literally shoulder to shoulder next to you or facing you, or you take a suicidal position and you open up. And that's what I've tried to do in most of my interventions in Beirut, and they were quite dangerous. And I owe that to my clients who basically went along, because it's not easy. It can be fatal.
What effect do you think the pandemic will have, or already perhaps has had, on your practice, on your work?
Well, so far I'm not very optimistic. First of all, I'm in a practice that is very much connected to economical and financial realities. I'm not a paper architect. I build. I've decided to take that risk. I have a lot of respect for those who I don't dismiss theory, but it's not me. I'm not in theory. So I engage with difficult contexts, and for that to happen, there has to be opportunities, and those only come when the economical situation makes it possible. So, on the one hand, this pandemic, this crisis we've been living the past few months has stopped or put many projects on hold that I hope will come back to life soon. So that was not necessarily positive. But on a more theoretical note, I'm not that optimistic either, because I don't know if anything very positive will come out of that. As far as I'm concerned, I don't feel any responsibility for what's been happening. I'm afraid people will stop hugging. I'm afraid people will stop eating meat. I don't want to hang out with people who are vegetarians and who don't drink alcohol, don't smoke, cyclists. I think this pandemic might make people even more a bit too reasonable.
I like that. I like the fact of you going from it might make people more a little bit too reasonable. Not more, just a little bit less.
Well, we've been too reasonable,
right?
In many respects. I'm talking about the creative practice.
No, I understand. Risk-taking in some way.
Well, on certain issues you cannot. There are certain questions you cannot raise. Certain posters you cannot take. Certain terms you cannot use.
We're back to irony in many ways.
We live in an extremely consensual period of questioning, of too much questioning. I'm talking about the creative fields.
Who do you turn to? What are the artists who do continue to inspire you? And I might add to that question, when was the last time you were moved by a building, be it in Beirut or elsewhere?
Oof. That's very subjective.
Of course.
Very subjective.
That's why I'm asking you.
I mean, I'm not going to surprise you. I'll say Abu Dhabi, the Louvre, because it's beyond the fact that it's an incredible architectural performance. What's very impressive is that the situation didn't call for anything extraordinary. The situation was totally absurd. Why build a museum? Museums are the cemeteries of culture, and why build a museum there? It was pathetic to begin with, and I think Nouvelle has has this still this potential to surprise us, to pervert the program and take it somewhere else. So it is no longer a museum, but it doesn't matter. It could have been on the moon. It could have been anywhere. It's a fantastic experience. This is someone who can still produce magic in architecture, and that's extremely rare. I'll think of my friend Rudy Ricciotti, the Mucem in Marseille, which also doesn't fall in any sort of established syntax, which is not, which goes way beyond the initial program. The Mucem is a parcours. The Mucem is not the museum, but it's an intervention that creates a set of incredible situations in the city. And this is a local who really knows his territory. So yes, there are still surprises in architecture, but there are very few.
So noticeable.
Yeah.
Is there a project you're working on now, even though, as you said, there's a hiatus due to the pandemic, that you're working on now that you are particularly excited by?
I am working on a project right now which is totally out of my is not what I've been doing over the past 20 or 30 years. I hate working on competitions. I don't like competitions. I think submitting a competition is like sitting behind a glass window in Amsterdam in a red light district. So you've got somebody who passes by and watches your boobs, your blonde, your brunette, and there's basically no engagement with your client in a competition. You're judged on very objective, and a very set of objective criteria that are very architectural. But whatever precedes the architectural act is not debated. So I don't think architectural competitions produce anything interesting. I haven't done many in my life. I've done a few. I lost all of them. But I've decided to engage in one lately, and we're working on that right now. Very far from my territory, very far from home, somewhere in California.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I hope this one will be a success, because then I can just drive to it and give you a real hug rather than a virtual hug. I've heard you say, and I've heard that you smile when someone tells you that one of your buildings is ugly. Why?
Yes.
Why?
Because I'm not interested in the architectural syntax. I'm not interested in producing a correct architecture. It is what precedes the architectural act that is important to me, and if we've managed to create a relevant situation, that's good to me. And whatever the means are, it doesn't matter. So if the building is plastically not so correct, it is totally irrelevant. In fact, I can take it as a compliment, because if it falls into, I've never been into models when it comes to women, for instance. No, I'm not interested in pretty pictures.
Reminds me.
I'm interested in pictures that have meaning.
It reminds me of a wonderful line of Proust where he says, "And to say that I fell in love and wasted my life with a woman who wasn't even my type."
Yep.
Bernard, of course.
I don't have a type.
Bernard, of course, I knew this would happen and would come to the end when we were just beginning. But I can't thank you enough for taking my call, and I hope we meet again. I loved meeting you in Beirut, and I hope next time we have more time, and certainly
Great.
time to have a good meal. and drink a lot. In the meantime,
I hope so too.
In the meantime, I send you a big virtual hug, and thank you for taking my call. And I leave you back in your neighborhood, the quarantine.
I hope to talk to you soon.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support